Jean Simmons, the beloved British actress and singer, lived in an elegant home in Los Angeles, a place that eventually gained a reputation for strange, unexplained events. While her career was filled with accomplishments, it was the haunting occurrences within her house that began to capture the attention of those who visited. It all started quietly at first, small, unexplainable noises that were dismissed as the quirks of an old house. But soon, those noises grew more frequent and distinct. Visitors would report hearing the sound of footsteps pacing through the hallways, always in the middle of the night. These sounds were not random, but seemed to follow a specific path, moving from one room to another, always growing louder and then fading into silence. But the footsteps weren't the only strange occurrence. Many who entered Jean's home began to notice that the doors, particularly the heavy, antique ones that adorned the hallways, would open on their own. It wasn't the slow, creaking kind of motion that would be expected from an old house. It was much more deliberate, almost as if someone invisible was pushing them open. Sometimes the doors would swing wide, then remain open for hours, even when no one had been near them. Perhaps the most unnerving of all the phenomena were the sightings of a shadowy figure, believed to be Jean herself. On more than one occasion, guests would see the silhouette of a tall, graceful woman standing in a doorway or by a window, but when they approached, no one was there. It was always the same shape, a faint outline of Jean, as though she were walking through the house even when she wasn't home. The figure would be gone before anyone could get close enough to identify it. Staff members, too, reported strange occurrences. Late at night, they would sometimes hear what sounded like humming, soft and haunting, almost like a song from another time. Some said it sounded like Jean's own voice, though it would be impossible for her to be singing at that hour. It was as if a memory or echo of her voice lingered in the air, calling out from the darkness of the house. Despite these unsettling events, Jean Simmons never publicly addressed the rumors of her haunted home. Yet, those who spent time there would often speak of a strange energy, a feeling of someone perhaps not quite gone still lingering within the walls. It was a house filled with beauty, but also one that carried with it an inexplicable sense of mystery, as though it held on to more than just the memories of its famous occupant. As time passed, the strange occurrences in Jean Simmons' Los Angeles home grew increasingly disturbing, shifting from whispers and fleeting shadows to something much more tangible and eerie. The house, with its sprawling gardens and vintage charm, began to take on an almost sentient quality, as though it was alive, reacting to the people who came and went. One of the most chilling reports came from a close friend who stayed in the guest suite one summer night. She awoke to the unmistakable sound of soft, rhythmic tapping on her bedroom door. Thinking it was just a servant or perhaps a family member checking in, she opened the door, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, save for the deep shadows cast by the flickering light of a distant lamp. Shrugging off the feeling, she returned to bed. But the tapping didn't stop. It came again, this time from the opposite direction, the farthest corner of the room. Her heart raced as she turned on the bedside lamp. Nothing. No one. The next morning, Jean apologized profusely, claiming that she hadn't heard a thing, but something about the way she said it felt off, as if she were hiding something or perhaps, as if she knew more than she was letting on. This unease was compounded by another oddity. Over the following weeks, the once beautiful garden, which had been meticulously kept, began to show signs of neglect. The plants withered for no apparent reason, and the stone statues that dotted the grounds became covered in a thick layer of dust. But even more unsettling was the presence of strange marks that seemed to appear overnight: scratches on the marble statues, deep gouges that couldn't be easily explained. Some believed it was simply vandalism, but others, including a few of Jean's closest confidants, began to suspect that something far darker was at play. And then, one afternoon, the music began. It started softly, barely audible, as if it were coming from far away. A haunting, melodic tune that seemed oddly familiar, yet impossible to place. It echoed through the house, filling the rooms with a sense of melancholy that weighed heavily on the chest. Those who were in the house at the time tried to track the source, but the music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as if the house itself were playing a tune, a long-forgotten melody that had been buried in its walls. Some would later claim that it sounded like Jean's voice, though no one could explain how it could be her, especially since she was nowhere near the house at the time. There were whispers of past residents of the property, people who had lived there long before Jean. Some said the house had once been the home of a prominent artist who had disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind only his unfinished paintings and an unsettling air. Others spoke of the land itself, suggesting that there was something ancient and unsettled about the area. Regardless, the rumors about Jean's house grew more elaborate and terrifying. One evening, during a small gathering, something occurred that would cement the house's reputation as a place of the inexplicable. A group of friends, all seasoned professionals in the entertainment industry, sat in the parlor, sipping wine and exchanging stories. The conversation turned to the subject of the strange occurrences that had plagued the home. Jean laughed it off, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that betrayed her calm demeanor. Just as the conversation was about to shift, a sudden crash from upstairs startled everyone. It wasn't the sound of an object falling, it was something heavier, something moving violently through the room. The group rushed up the stairs, only to find the hallway bathed in eerie, unnatural light. The door to Jean's personal study had been violently flung open. Inside, the walls were covered in smudges, marks that looked disturbingly like handprints, dark, almost black, and smeared across the woodwork. In the center of the room, the furniture had been overturned, as though a struggle had taken place. But the most disturbing sight of all was the old mirror on the far wall, once a prized possession of Jean's, now cracked down the center, its shards reflecting distorted fragments of the room. Jean stood at the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She swore that she had been downstairs the entire time and hadn't heard a thing. But the look on her face said otherwise. There was an expression of quiet terror, as if she had been expecting this. She turned to the group and whispered in a voice barely above a whisper, "Some things should never be disturbed." The room fell silent. Everyone knew this wasn't just a case of an old house with too many creaks and groans. Something or someone was there, and it wasn't going away. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The next few days were marked by an unsettling tension. Despite the chaos in Jean's study, she insisted that everything was fine. But those who had witnessed the event couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker had begun to unfold. The atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier, like the air itself was thick with unspoken fears. Even the light outside seemed dimmer, as though the sun had decided to hide behind a perpetual haze, adding to the pervasive gloom. That evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, a strange thing happened. The doorbell rang at precisely midnight. It wasn't a sound anyone could ignore. It was sharp, clear, and insistent, echoing through the corridors like a warning. Jean, already on edge from the recent events, hesitated before answering the door. When she opened it, there was no one there. But the air was cold, frigid even, as if a gust of wind had blown through the entrance despite the lack of any breeze. At first, Jean thought it was a prank. But as she stepped back inside, something caught her eye on the doorstep, an old, weathered envelope, its edges curled as if it had been sitting there for years. She picked it up with trembling hands, staring at the handwriting that adorned the front. It wasn't in ink, but in something that resembled a dark, rust-colored stain. The message was short, a single line. "The past will never let you leave." Jean's heart raced as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The chill didn't leave. Instead, it seemed to follow her, creeping through the house like an unwanted visitor. She quickly locked all the doors, turned off the lights, and retreated into the comfort of her bedroom, trying to shake the sense of dread that clung to her like a shadow. The following morning, Jean was nowhere to be found. Her housekeeper arrived early as usual, but when she entered the kitchen, she was met with an eerie silence. Jean's breakfast was left half-eaten on the table, a cup of tea still steaming beside it. The housekeeper called out for Jean, but there was no answer. After searching the house from top to bottom, she found nothing until she entered the study. The room was in disarray, as it had been the night before, but this time something was different. The mirror, which had been cracked so violently, was now whole again. It was as if it had been restored to its original condition, but the reflection it cast was far from ordinary. Instead of showing the room, the mirror reflected a twisted version of the house, darker, decayed, with overgrown vines creeping up the walls. But the most chilling detail was the figure standing at the center of the reflection. A woman in a long, flowing gown, her face obscured by shadows, staring back with eyes that seemed to burn with an ancient fury. The housekeeper rushed out of the room, her mind racing with terror. She knew something was horribly wrong. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the events. There was something about Jean herself that seemed to have changed, as though the woman who had once lived there had vanished, replaced by something else, something ancient, something hungry. That afternoon, a friend of Jean's, an actress who had known her for years, arrived to check in on her. She was met with the same unsettling atmosphere, but as she walked through the hallways, she felt a strange sensation, as though she were being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her steps faltered when she reached the foyer. The door to the basement stood ajar. She had never seen it open before. With a mix of hesitation and curiosity, she descended the staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was large, filled with old furniture and relics from Jean's past. But in the farthest corner, hidden beneath a faded rug, she found something that made her blood run cold. A trapdoor. Her heart raced as she knelt beside it, the heavy, musty smell of earth rising up from the cracks. With trembling hands, she pulled at the latch, and the door creaked open with a groan that seemed to reverberate throughout the house. She shone her flashlight into the darkness below, but what she saw made her freeze. At the bottom of the stairs, in the dim light, was a room. The walls were lined with old bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes and strange artifacts. But what caught her attention was the table in the center of the room. It was covered in old photographs, black and white images of Jean at various stages of her life, some that she didn't recognize, and others that were strangely altered. Faces had been scratched out or blurred, leaving only dark smudges. And in the corner, a photo of Jean, older than she was now, standing with a group of people she didn't know, all of them smiling as if in some private, dark secret. But it was the figure in the background that made her gasp. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, standing just beyond Jean's shoulder. His features were unmistakable, yet his presence felt completely wrong, like a shadow that didn't belong in the picture. As she backed away, the floor creaked beneath her. The flashlight flickered and died. Then, in the silence of the basement, she heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper, carried through the darkness. "She's not alone." The voice was unmistakable, familiar yet distant. It was Jean's voice, but the words she spoke weren't her own. They were words that had been forgotten long ago, words from a time far before Jean had ever stepped foot into the house. And then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, something shifted, a shadow moving with unnatural speed, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The air in the basement thickened, pressing down on her chest as the whisper continued to echo in the darkness, growing louder, more insistent. The words became clearer, as if the very walls of the house were speaking them into existence. Each syllable a warning, a beckoning. "She's not alone. It's not her. It never was." A sudden chill swept over her, and for a moment, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, as if unseen eyes were piercing through her very soul. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, flashlight still dead in her hands, her heart hammering in her chest. The basement was silent again, eerily so. No creaks, no whispers, just the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. Her feet moved of their own accord, slowly stepping back toward the stairs, the sense of danger growing with each hesitant step. The trapdoor creaked closed, as if the house itself was trying to trap her inside. But just as her fingers brushed against the cold, wooden steps, she froze. A sound, a movement so faint she almost missed it, a shadow shifting just beyond the edge of her vision. She turned her head sharply, but there was nothing there, except the photographs, the ones that had been scattered across the table. They were now all facing up, and in each one, there was something new. a shadow like a figure standing just outside the frame. Something was moving within the photographs, a dark, liquid distortion that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. She leaned closer, her pulse racing. There, in the most recent photo of Jean, something was different. Jean was standing with a group of people at a dinner table, laughing, her eyes bright with life. But there, behind her, was the same figure from the basement, the gaunt man. Only now, his form was clearer, his features sharper. He was closer, and his eyes, they weren't just hollow anymore. They were alive, watching her. The flashlight flickered back to life in her hands, though she didn't recall it turning on. She turned it slowly toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to ripple. And there, in the deepest darkness, she saw someone moving. At first, she thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the light. But then it stepped forward. A figure in a long, flowing gown, its edges tattered and stained. The figure was tall, too tall, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity, as though its body was not bound by the same laws of physics as her own. Its face was hidden in shadows, but the faintest glimmer of moonlight caught the edge of its features. It was Jean, but it wasn't Jean. The figure stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under its weight, but it made no sound. No footsteps, just the air growing colder and heavier, as though the very atmosphere was being sucked out of the room. The actress felt her body freeze, paralyzed by the sight. The figure reached out, a hand outstretched toward her, its fingers long and twisted. The air around her grew thick with a presence, an old, ancient presence. The figure's lips barely moved, but she heard its voice in her mind. "You should never have come." Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and thicker, until they were no longer just shadows but something alive, something crawling, twitching. The photographs on the table began to tremble, shifting on their own as if the people in them were trying to break free, their faces contorted in silent screams. The floor beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with a pulse, like the heartbeat of the house itself. And then, through the overwhelming dread and chaos, she heard it again. The whisper, louder this time. "She is not who you think she is. She's been here long before you." Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the words. What did it mean? What was speaking to her? The woman in the gown seemed to grow taller, its shadow stretching across the room as if it was absorbing the very light around it. The presence that had always lingered in the house, just out of reach, was now here manifested, real. Desperately, she turned toward the stairs, but as she did, she caught sight of something else. A dark figure standing at the top of the basement stairs, a silhouette barely visible in the dim light. This figure wasn't a shadow, it was solid, tangible, and unmistakably human. A man. The gaunt figure, the one from the photographs, stared down at her. His hollow eyes locked onto hers. His face was stretched, unnaturally thin, his skin taut over bone, like the remains of something long dead. But his eyes, they were the eyes of someone who had never truly been alive, a soul trapped in eternal limbo. The actress's breath hitched. She knew, somehow, that this was no coincidence. The house, the strange events, the shadowy figure that had followed Jean, it was all part of something much larger. Something that had been buried beneath the house, waiting to be uncovered. The darkness was not just a haunting, it was alive, and it had been feeding, growing, for decades. And Jean? Jean was the key. With a final, piercing scream, the lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. The whispering stopped. Everything went silent. Then the house itself began to shake. The ground trembled beneath her feet, the house groaning as if it were coming to life. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the temperature plummeted to freezing, her breath visible in the air. The gaunt man at the top of the stairs moved forward, his footsteps slow, deliberate, but somehow impossibly quick. The figure in the gown reached out, its hand hovering inches from her face. In a final surge of terror, the actress ran toward the trapdoor, her fingers fumbling desperately for the latch. But as she opened it, a force stronger than anything she had ever felt pushed her back. She crashed into the cold, damp floor of the basement, gasping for air as the house continued to quake around her. The whisper returned, louder now, as if the very walls were speaking in unison. "She's been waiting for you." Suddenly, everything stopped. The shaking, the whispers, the cold, it all vanished in an instant. The house fell silent once more, its eerie stillness swallowing the sound of her panicked breathing. When she dared to look up, she saw Jean's face, staring down at her from the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with a haunting emptiness. The actress could feel it, the presence, the thing that had always been there, the thing that had taken Jean long ago. And in that moment she understood. Jean had never truly left the house. She had become part of it, trapped within its walls, a conduit for something far older, far darker. The house was alive, and Jean's soul, along with countless others, had been consumed by it. The last thing the actress saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was Jean's mouth opening in a silent scream. But no sound came, and then nothing. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.